Okay, morning everybody. As Suzanne said, I'm Stephanie Miller from ECU. You'll see on the slide that we also have David down presenting. This morning we've had a combination of travel and technical difficulties, so you've just got me. Hopefully we'll make it through and it'll be fine. I've got a bit of a cold, so we'll see how it goes. As Suzanne said, we're going to keep an eye on the questions and I'll do my best to answer them as I go along. If that isn't possible, we'll do a kind of follow-up afterwards where we email everybody as we go along. Right, so what we're going to cover today, I'm going to give you an overview of the legal requirements that have led up to the equal pay reporting. There's kind of a legal history to this that's useful to have an overview of. I'm going to look at occupational segregation, particularly for race, disability and gender, which is the legal requirements for next year. We're going to quickly cover how you calculate the pay gap. There's a couple of relatively straightforward calculations for you to use, and then I will talk briefly about developing an equal pay statement. For those of you who were around earlier, this session is actually based on a previous workshop that ECU ran in partnership with Close the Gap in October. It's kind of a distilled and condensed version of that, but thanks do go to Close the Gap particularly for helping us with the development of this. Okay, so there are quite a few sort of legal backdrops that we do need to have a look at when we're talking about equal pay and occupational segregation. In that the public sector equality duty in the Equality Act of 2010 does have some requirements in it that tells you that a public authority has to exercise in its functions, have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimisation and any other conduct that's prohibited. It must also advance the equality of opportunity between persons who share relevant protected characteristics and those who don't, and to foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and those who don't. That's the legislative underpinning essentially for the specific duties regulations that were from 2012. The specific duties require all public bodies to report on their equality mainstreaming, to gather, analyse and use employee data, to report on equality outcomes, report on the gender pay gap, produce equal pay statements, and a relatively new development, which I'll cover in a little bit more depth, to actually report on board diversity as well. So to start with equality mainstreaming, the duty requires all public authorities to produce mainstreaming reports, essentially which shows how they are moving towards embedding equality within every aspect of their work and their functions. It also has to include data analysis of employee statistics. It is about progress. It's not just about kind of it's not a static report that's based on time. The difference between the reporting from last time and the reporting this time is that you do need to have demonstrated how you have moved towards embedding equality within all your functions. And the data aspect of it, which is quite important, does relate to staff. What we've found when we've done overviews of people's reports is there is a heavy focus on students, but the specific duties regulations specifically say that you provide data in relation to your employees regarding recruitment, development and retention of staff. Your equality outcomes, it's likely that a lot of you will be working on these right now because you're due to report on them very soon. Your equality outcomes, essentially, it's a list of outcomes, usually 3 or 4, maybe 5, every 4 years, that says this is what you're trying to work at. It's very high level strategic outcomes that you're looking at. It needs to be very well informed by data. Those two things need to connect very specifically. And you need to have progress indicators and a narrative. So as I said, you're working towards something, so it's not I will report on this every 4 years. It's the stages that you will meet as you go along. And what it should include also is the causes of any pay gaps that you have identified. The specific duties also require you to publish a gender pay gap figure. which is the percentage difference between men and women's average hourly pay excluding overtime. This used to be, at the last round of reporting, this was for authorities that had more than 150 employees. This round of reporting is for authorities that have at least 20, which will cover most, if not all, colleges now. The duty only requires you to produce one figure, but it must include all employees, including the senior management. Okay. You're also required to produce an equal pay statement. This is where some of the changes are coming in this year. The equal pay statement, again for employees for organisations with employees more than 20 employees, you are now required to produce an equal pay statement on race and disability. Previously, it was only on gender. Public authorities that don't determine their own pay systems still are required to gather this information and need to take any appropriate action to show that they're identifying the causes of that pay gap, and which are within their control. So you do need to look at the causes. It's preferable also that you can consult employees and trade unions on the development of this pay policy, because as the equal pay statement will influence your equality outcomes, these will impact ultimately on staff and should have their involvement as far as possible. The new one, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, is a relatively new development. Excuse me, that only came into law this year. All public authorities are now required to produce board succession planning in relation to diversity, and also to publish gender statements on the makeup of the composition of their boards. This is a relatively new development, but it will have to be done for April 2017. And the process that's happening at the moment is the Scottish Government, who is leading on some of this, will be getting in touch individually with every board member on college boards, asking them for their equality data. The government will then aggregate and anonymise the equality data and give a sector-wide statement back to the chair of all the college boards to use for succession planning. The boards themselves are responsible for gathering the gender composition of their board and are required to include this data in their equality monitoring reports. The government should be getting in touch with everybody around about now. The plan is to have the aggregated data back for February to allow inclusion in reports for April. Okay, what I would like to talk about now is some of the things that we know, or the things that we've learned from the last round of reporting, sort of watch points, if you like, to bear in mind as you go about your reporting strategies for this year. One of the things that has cropped up quite a lot in our conversations, which I'm sure you're aware of, is the equality pipeline, sort of the education pipeline. When you are producing your data and identifying, your occupational segregation, your equality outcomes, and where you as an institution want to go with these, you'll be aware that you're at a point in this pipeline, and there are other things that might influence that you find that you may have less control over. It's important to recognise your place within the pipeline in relation to your student body and your staff body, and build this into your equality outcomes. Particularly if your organisation is working with other public sector organisations under community planning legislation. Some organisations have joined forces with other public bodies to produce regional equality outcomes, and it is worth recognising where in the pipeline that you sit, but also where in the pipeline that your partners sit, to try and have as cohesive an approach as possible. The other thing that we want to kind of draw your attention to is the various issues that we identified from reports and publications from last time, to kind of run through some of these with you. In terms of, for instance, gathering employee data, which you are required to do for recruitment, development and retention, we found recently that there's often incomplete and inconsistent detail. Not all institutions are collecting across all protected characteristics, which is a legal requirement. The counter to that is that some institutions, many institutions, have issues around disclosure rates and gaps in reporting. So for instance, particularly around disability disclosure, those figures are extremely low compared to what we know as national data. In terms of the mainstreaming report, we're aware that there's maybe a slight lack of understanding of what that looks like. People are sort of quite good at reporting very static data, but in terms of progress towards mainstreaming, that seems to be slightly more inconsistent and less clear. And again, there's more of a service user focus on that reporting rather than a focus on staff data. In terms of the quality outcomes, sometimes they can be a little bit generic, and it's important to ensure that they are measurable. This is something that you do have to report on, and your progress towards them with a narrative. So it's important to have a measurable actions, and it's also important to have evidence of the action and the progress towards it, to kind of pad out the narrative a little bit. In terms of the gender pay gap, which was a requirement last time and this time, some people just publish the highest pay gaps. It's important to publish mean and median data, which we'll cover later. So, and also there's often little or no analysis that goes with this. Again, it's important to remember that this is a narrative. What are the causes of it? Why has this come about, and what are you doing to kind of redress the imbalance? In terms of equal pay statements, it is important to restate your college's commitment to principles. What are you trying to do, and why are you trying to do it? And also, again, I go back to the having a narrative, having the kind of the pipeline of why this is an issue. Have you identified the causes of it, and what you're trying to do about those things? One thing to kind of highlight, and I think I'm hoping I'm getting that across by essentially repeating lots and lots of "you must have a narrative," is that sorry, I turned my mute on by accident. I do apologise. Yes, so it's important to recognise that the public sector equality duty and the specific duties are a process. They're not a point in time. It's not a we will report in April. April is the reporting, but it's a progress towards that reporting. So it's important to remember that there are points in time, and that all of the things that we talked about earlier, they all connect. They should all flow through each other, and they do fit together very, very nicely. And ultimately, we hope, as you can see in the bottom corner, that all of these things do actually lead to systemic and embedded change within an organisation. I'm going to run through, excuse me, a few slides now, looking particularly at pay gap and occupational segregation in relation to gender, race and disability. Okay, so if we start with gender, these figures are fairly widely reported. On average, for every pound a man earns, a woman earns 85p. And you'll see there's been quite a lot of reporting in the media in the past few weeks around the point in time where various women's organisations are advertising that women should stop working because they've done their work for the pay that they've had for that year compared to the pay that a man gets. So on average, overall, it's about 15% lower than a man's wage. What we found is that if we look at the pay gap as the end product almost, there are kind of underpinning reasons as to why that might happen. So we've identified that some of the causes are occupational segregation, inflexible working and discrimination. And underneath those, there are various kind of factors that influence those. So in terms of occupational segregation, it's important to remember that occupational segregation is both vertical and horizontal. So in terms of horizontal segregation, we mean things like, the difference between what is stereotypically women's work and what is stereotypically men's work. But also vertical occupational segregation is that the higher up the chain you go, regardless of the occupation, generally there are fewer and fewer women as you go up. In terms of men and women's work-life balance, there are quite a lot of things that influence that as well, particularly obviously childcare and caring responsibilities. The lack of women in the boardroom is an issue. The government is obviously trying very hard at the moment to redress that balance by having their 50-50 by 2020 campaign. In terms of inflexible working, we all know that childcare provision is an issue that impacts on both men and women. And in terms of discrimination, we have a difference in pay and reward and the value of women's work compared to men's work, in the fact that even now there are still cases where women are challenging en masse the value of their work and the reward, the monetary reward that they get as part of that. So for those of you who are still around, I was wanting to ask you a question. If we look at the 6 categories right at the bottom, and we were thinking about how you're going to be working towards addressing your gender pay gap and occupational segregation in your institutions, of the 6, which are the top 3 that you think as an organisation that you would want to be working on? Maybe give you a couple of minutes to do that before I move on. Okay, interesting. So it looks like the majority of you are looking to address this notion of men and women's work, closely followed by childcare issues, which has a massive impact also on men and women's work, and all of you are looking to address men and women's work. Closely followed by childcare issues and pay and reward. Okay, that's quite interesting to know. Okay, thank you. If we move on, I'm going to quickly go through this because all of these figures are kind of fairly public. But if we look very much at the percentage of men and women in Scottish industry, you can see that men kind of dominate in the majority of what are considered to be men's jobs, obviously. So construction, transport, and energy and manufacturing, whereas women dominate in the kind of what's seen as softer employment, so administration, so public health, public education, the kind of more caring responsibilities. Okay. If we look at that in terms of occupational segregation by occupational groups, again you can see men dominating in trades. We've got process plant and machine operatives, women dominating in sort of caring and secretarial industries. And in colleges, a similar thing. We see women dominating in the kind of softer skills, so hairdressing and beauty, men dominating in construction and engineering. I don't expect any of these will come as a surprise to you. These are national figures that we produced in our Equality in Colleges Scotland statistical reports. Quickly doing the same for modern apprenticeships. Again, early years in care is 100% women. You can see if we go back to the pipeline that these things are all connecting. And it's worth remembering that you have a role in trying to address some of these issues, but to be aware of where your influences sit within that pipeline. So looking at the same thing for race, The UK race pay gap, it does show that there is quite a significant pay gap between white workers, black, Asian, minority, ethnic workers, and black workers, increasing for those who identify predominantly as black. But you'll see that actually if you could look closely at starting at GCSE level and moving up to degree, the pay gap actually widens the higher up the educational achievement ladder that you actually go. So again, looking at sort of indicators, trying to understand what the issues for that pay gap is. For BA, ME staff, you're looking predominantly at occupational segregation and discrimination. So in terms of occupational segregation, you're looking quite heavily at sort of educational opportunities. There are quite significant differences in educational achievement of black and minority ethnic students compared to their white comparators. As a result, there are quite restricted opportunities for BA, ME staff, and also there are perceptions of what people the kind of jobs that we're looking at. So similar to the glass ceiling, for BA, ME workers, there's also a hierarchy ceiling. So there comes a point where it's actually harder and harder for black and minority ethnic staff to move up the chain. And what we've found is that there's actually quite a significant difference when you look at gender. Black and minority ethnic women have quite a significant multiple disadvantage compared to black and minority ethnic men. And it's also important to bear in mind sort of race and nationality differences. In education in Scotland, a lot of BME staff are actual international staff working in institutions, and potentially that could sort of skew some of the data in relation to national averages. In terms of discrimination, we've got societal attitudes and behaviours are obviously quite significant in terms of recruitment, promotion, selection for BAME staff. Again, I would like to ask you, if you're looking at your kind of occupational segregation and reporting for race, which of the bottom 6 would be the top 3 that you would want to be looking to work on? Okay, that's interesting. Significantly, you're predominantly looking at educational opportunities, followed by attitudes and behaviour, with restricted opportunities coming in third. Yeah, which is interesting, but I'd really like to draw your attention to the fact that when you're doing a lot of your legal reporting, it is important to remember that you're reporting in relation to staff. So while you can look at your educational opportunities of your staff complement, that's one of the kind of key things that they will be looking for in terms of your reporting mechanisms. Okay. So moving on, having a very quick look at occupational segregation in terms of race, we know that there's an overrepresentation of minority groups in temporary, casual, and generally insecure work. And within some occupations, the race gap is less. Again, that goes back to the restricted opportunities. So in maybe temporary work or lower paid occupations, there will be less of a race gap because there'll be higher levels of people from minority ethnic groups within those occupations. What do we know from colleges in Scotland in terms of this? Actually, not very much. There's very little national data at the moment that we can draw upon. So any data that we have in terms of occupational segregation at this point is organisational specific. Again, moving on and looking at disability, the UK disability pay gap is actually quite significant. But again, you'll notice that disabled women are multiply disadvantaged in the sense that their pay gap is considerably wider than that for disabled men. So when you're actually looking at doing some of your reporting and your narrative and your analysis, it's to maybe consider some of the kind of cross fertilization of some of these ideas, where some of these things come from. What we do know is that disabled people are more likely to be the lower end of earnings distribution. Average hours are obviously lower. And to change a lot of this, we are actually having to look at economic equality. So that does go beyond what you have control over. Again, it's part of that pipeline. Which bits can you manage and which bits can you influence? So again, looking at the disability indicators, some of these are slightly different, largely because of the need for physical adjustments or working adjustments for disabled people. But there is a narrative. So things that influence the pay gap, we know that there's occupational segregation and issues with reasonable adjustments and discrimination. So underneath occupational segregation, again, educational opportunities are a really big issue. Disabled people are a lot less likely to have higher qualifications than non-disabled people, which then influences the kind of work that they can go into. There are restricted opportunities in the sense that there are some jobs that maybe appear too demanding for some disabled people, and again, employers that are maybe less likely to employ disabled people, partly because of the issues around reasonable adjusting. So access to funding and support and workplace limitations can be quite significant, and there are increasing numbers of cuts that are happening in terms of what is available to employers and employees in accessing these for disabled staff. In terms of discrimination, attitudes and behaviours are significant. The assumptions that people make around disabled people's abilities and competences are systemic and quite well embedded in some cases. And there's also maybe potentially a lack of understanding around issues around disability-related leave and the fact that some disabled people might need disability-related time off and those kinds of things, and how that is actually different from standard time off. So again, if we look at your reporting mechanisms, of the bottom six, so education opportunities, restricted opportunities, funding and support, workplace limitations, I see some of you are going there already, which are the top three of those six that you would be wanting to work on? Excuse me. Okay, bit more evenly spread this time, that's interesting. So, the top one, even, attitudes and behaviours compared to disability-related leave are very high up there, but it's very closely followed by the various workplace limitations, but not far behind as restricted opportunities. I think this one's more interesting. It's much more evenly spread, and I think some of these things are quite interconnected. It can be difficult to unpick some of them. Okay, so moving on. What we do know, despite the fact that the employment gap is different, the employment rates of disabled men and women are quite similar, and the causes of occupational segregation are considerably under-researched for disabled people, but we do know that they do tend to work in lower paid jobs, partly because they have limited education and partly because the access to employment is different. But it's also important to remember, and again this goes back to the narrative that we talk about at the beginning, when you're looking to talk about things like pay gaps and occupational segregation, unpick it a little bit. So these are likely to be different by different impairment types and different experiences of the education system. Different attitudinal and societal barriers will impact more, and it's quite important to kind of address some of those in your reporting. What we do know nationally is that 20% of the Scottish population has a long-term health problem or impairment. That comes from the last 2011 census. But what do we know about disability amongst college staff? It's actually not very much. We don't have national figures at this point in time. What we do know is that disclosure rates for disability within colleges are ridiculously low compared to the national average. it is something that we do need to look at, and it is something that you might want to consider putting into your reporting mechanisms as a kind of first stage in addressing some of the wider issues. Okay, so now we come to the fun part. Calculating and analysing your gender pay gap. I have these slides. I am going to pretty much just talk through the slides because the slides contain all the information, so if you need to refer back to them, you can just take the slide for later. It's important that you have a single figure, that you include all your employees, including senior management. You have to calculate the mean and the median as a comparison, and overall it's important to look at full-time and part-time figures. That would be helpful. Okay, so when you need to calculate it based on the hourly average, excluding overtime for men and women. So it's important to determine the basic hourly rate of pay for each employee. If the pay rate is annual, then you basically have to just keep on dividing until you have the hourly rate. So assuming an annual salary of 37 hours per week, obviously you divide it to give you the week, which divided by 52 gives you the week, and then divide it by 37 gives you the average or the hourly pay for that individual. To calculate the mean hourly rate of pay, you take the total of all the kind of male employees' rates of pay. So you add all of that up, and then you would divide it by the 7 groups of staff that you've got. Okay. So to calculate the mean gap, there is a formula that you have to use. Okay, so assuming A minus B over A, I sound like a maths teacher, this is terrifying. A minus B over A times 100. So if A is the hourly rate of pay for male employees and B is the hourly rate of pay for female employees, you're basically saying male hourly rate minus female hourly rate divided by male hourly rate times 100. So assuming the men's mean hourly pay is 18.57, women's mean hourly pay is 14.76, you minus 18.57 minus 14.76 times 100 gives you the percentage pay gap between men and women. And then you calculate the median rate of pay, which is essentially the midpoint, and therefore the men's median rate of pay, for instance, in this example is £16. And then you use a similar formula. So you use the median hourly rate for men minus the median hourly rate for women divided by the median hourly rate for men times 100. Okay, and that should give you your average, your median pay gap of 17% in this particular example. Okay. It's important, again, as I said this so many times, but the narrative in this conversation is crucial. It's important to provide the accompanying narrative to explain the data. The data alone doesn't really tell us very much at all. And again, it's the progress, so the analysis of any change since the last reporting. And that includes what actions you've taken to reduce the pay gap, what changes you need to make to your policies, and what changes you're going to make for next time's reporting. Okay. I'm going to quickly look at how you establish your equal pay statement. It is important to commit your organisation to do an equal pay review as early on as possible. The EHRC actually gives guidance on how to conduct equal pay reviews in large and small organisations, and I can send you the link to that if you need to have a look. It's important to try and set clear and manageable objectives that are measurable, with clear actions that you intend to take, with planned programmes of work. Importantly, assigning responsibility as well. Who's actually going to do the various bits of this work? And recognising that actually there might be resources that you need to put into this, that you need to commit your organisation to make some changes. So in terms of this, you need to consider analysing and using data. So this is kind of the process that we've identified that you go through. So you have to do some data analysis, followed by kind of a slightly higher analysis over, like for instance, grades and protected characteristics. So you start to unpick the information. You look at finding supporting information, and then you start your planning. So from that information, you've identified your initiatives, targets that you want to look at, and then you would repeat the analysis to refine the process. Bearing in mind we're looking at trying to get this done for April 2017 next year. If we assume that the first block is 1 and the bottom block is 6, so repeat analysis, refine the process, at what stage of the process is your college at this point? Okay. Okay, you're still quite early on at this point. You're all still roughly at the first cut of data, and then half of you at the first analysis, the first detailed analysis of the data. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, thanks. Okay, so just an example of this, I'll run through very quickly. For instance, you've identified that there are fewer women than men successfully being internally promoted. That has, on your kind of second sweep of the data, you've identified that actually it's part-time women that are potentially the most disadvantaged. So then you would maybe look at, to kind of find a bit more information around that, you would maybe run targeted surveys with your employees, and this would maybe give you further data. For instance, this example says it identifies 85% of staff don't feel that part-time work is suitable, or some roles aren't suitable for part-time work. So then what you would consider doing as your action would be review all of your recruitment processes to ensure that everything about that is appropriate for part-time staff, particularly part-time women staff. And then as a review process, you would review this on a regular basis over the kind of next year, assess your progress and your development, identify if there isn't any, why not, and continue to do this review process. Okay. ECU has a publication which could be quite helpful about this. It's not widely known about because it was produced for Wales, but it's still relevant outside of Wales, which looks at checking your pay policies. And it is kind of quite a practical resource that helps you kind of identify some of the things we've just talked about. And it could be quite useful for you if you kind of want to download that and have a look and see how that influences the work that you're currently trying to do.